Hello AP students, welcome back. My name is Mr. Vogel. I'm going to walk you through Module 69 today as we look at some of our learning targets. For today, we're going to be talking about somatic symptom disorders, dissociative disorders, and how those differ from schizophrenia and personality disorders. They are not the same. They are a very different category. And then also, we're going to look at personality disorders, specifically antisocial personality disorder, and some of the traits, the categories that make up those personality disorders, looking at cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. So let's go ahead and get into our lecture. First disorder category we're going to be looking at is somatic symptom disorder. So what is somatic symptom disorder? It occurs when a person manifests a psychological problem through a physiological symptom. All right, so in other words, yes, it is an actual physical disorder, and yes, there are actual physical symptoms. However, there are no physical causes, or there's no evidence for physical causes for those physical symptoms that do occur. So when we look at symptoms, like this other bullet point, symptoms take a somatic or bodily form without any physical cause. Somatic, right, looking at the root word there, is soma. When we go back to Unit 2, looking at biological basis of behavior, we looked at the neuron, the soma, body, the cell body, right, or the region of the brain, the somatosensory cortex, okay? Those words are related to somatic symptom disorder. And so, yes, there are bodily physical symptoms, but there are no physical causes for those symptoms. It's strictly psychological. And there are two main types that we're going to discuss mentioned in your book, and that'll be IAD, illness anxiety disorder, originally known as a hypochondriasis, or you might have heard the term hypochondriac. There's a lot of stigma to that, so they've veered away from that. And then you have conversion disorder. We're going to talk about those. But somatic symptom disorders and stress are highly correlated. When we look at this word psychoneuroimmunology, but if you break it down, it's pretty simple. Psycho, we're just looking at sense of the mind, right? The cognitive processes. Neuro, we're looking at the brain and its influences. And then immunology, the study of the endocrine system, hormone system, and how that affects our body. So all these things affect our body. And then we have this other word here, lymphocytes. Again, these are just related to your immune system. And all this comes from Unit 8 when we talk about motivation, emotion, and stress. These are probably terms you should remember and study for your AP exam coming up here in May. Yeah, this is just an explanation of how our body and our stress and our cognitive processes also affect our biology. They also affect our physical symptoms, our physical health. So within somatic symptom disorders, you have these fictitious disorders, and they're basically what they sound like, right? When a person falsely reports or deliberately creates or exaggerates symptoms to get medical attention. Here are two that are very common. You have Munchausen syndrome, not very common, common within fictitious disorders, and then Ganser syndrome. And so they're kind of similar in some ways. Ganser syndrome is more related to person deliberately or consciously acting as if he or she has a physical or mental illness, and it's self-directed. Munchausen syndrome is also self-directed, but they will physically impair themselves. And then you have Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which is when you'll physically impair someone else that's closest to you. And the reason for these is because you have this deep emotional illness that desires significant attention and sympathy. And so in order to get that sympathy, you'll take extreme measures, right? And I'm talking extreme measures to get that sympathy and that attention. Munchausen syndrome by proxy is pretty sick. It's pretty twisted. If you've ever seen the movie Sixth Sense, the mother poisons her own daughter to the point that the daughter dies. what she does to keep her sick for years is she puts bleach in her soup every day and feeds it to her. And she does this because she desires that significant emotional attention and sympathy from others around her. And then when she loses her daughter, yes, it's sad for her, but she gets that attention, she gets that sympathy that she desires at the risk of killing her own daughter. So, yeah, it's pretty heavy stuff. And when you ask yourself, like, oh, well, why are these disorders then, right? If they're fictitious, why are they even disorders? Right. I mean, yes, they are fictitious, and there is some sense of faking or deceivement in these behaviors, but they're still extremely abnormal to physically impair yourself to get attention. Right? It's not normal to inject your own feces into your blood to make yourself sick. That's not normal. That's very abnormal. So, what is a conversion disorder? Still staying within that form of somatic symptom disorders. Originally, this was known as functional neurological symptom disorder. So it's related to some kind of neurological symptom a lot of times. These people report the existence of these severe physical problems, yet there's no biological explanation for them, right? So they're unexplainable. There's no clinically proven, there's no medical cause, there's no neurological cause that doctors can find to explain these physical symptoms, such as blindness, deafness, weakness, limb tremors, paralysis. Some people report having glove amnesia, where they can't feel their hand. However, everything's like completely healthy in terms of their neurological system, and they can feel from the wrist up. They can feel their entire arm, yet they say they can't feel their hand. Well, we know that this is anatomically impossible because it's not. Sensory input is not related to that, right? Sensory input is related to our spine, where our spine receives that information. So when we look at, like, why does this occur? Why do people report these neurological symptoms? And generally the reason is because they have some type of extreme stressful situation or traumatic event that's occurred, and therefore by doing this, by bringing up these symptoms, it allows that individual to somewhat cope and escape a stressful situation so that they can receive attention, right, and sympathy from others, which is what they crave, which they desire. And so that's kind of why these symptoms probably arise in most people. And it can happen in childhood, it can happen in adolescence, and it can happen in adulthood as well. But generally you see it in these two time periods and development, probably related to some type of abuse, most likely. So looking at illness anxiety disorder, this is still within the same category of somatic symptom form disorders. And IAD, when people have IAD, they generally have frequent physical complaints for which medical doctors are unable to actually locate any type of cause, right, to the symptoms that they're experiencing. So people have a severe obsession with having or possibly getting some type of serious illness, despite having really no indication of illness following a medical exam, right? So, for instance, serious illness like cancer, or right now, COVID-19, coronavirus, right? After going and seeking a medical exam, there's no evidence of that person having that illness, yet they still believe that they have it, and that their symptoms, like common things, normal sensations like headaches, upset stomachs, cramps, are related to this dreaded disease that's all in their head. And so there are three major characteristics: physiological arousal. Okay, this is going to be related to their anxiety, their disturbances in their sleep, right? This extreme fear of getting this disorder, and then they're going to have bodily focuses. This might be when the person is constantly checking their bodies for any signs repetitively, and then you've got behaviors designed to avoid or check for these physical illnesses with repetitive medical consultation. So they'll constantly go to the doctor. They go to the doctor way too much. They switch doctors frequently to try to get this confirmation of this illness that they think they have, because they're so afraid that they have it. Now, one major difference between this and in the conversion disorder is when looking at conversion disorder, there are obviously aspects of faking a sickness. But in this case, the person's not faking being sick. They actually believe that they are sick. There's a little bit of difference between hypochondriasis and conversion disorder. Now, when looking at the explanations, this is what we need to just remember. Conversion disorder, people are nearly always triggered by some type of stressful event, whether it's emotional, a conflict, related to some stressful childhood experience, could be a natural disaster. Easterners and women typically are more vulnerable to conversion disorder. And then we have IAD, illness anxiety disorder. Although the causes are unclear, it's thought that these inherited personality traits, life experiences, and upbringing may also play a role. So there are biological aspects, there are social aspects related to these, and they all kind of intertwine, right, when looking at the biopsychosocial approach. So what are dissociative disorders? We're looking at a new category here now, and the key word here is dissociation, all right? This is like daydreaming. It's like getting lost in the moment, okay? We all experience this. It's very common. You've ever taken a route before that you've done over and over and over and over again. You tend to daydream at times, right? And think about things. And you're not focusing on every little detail around you. So we all experience some sort of dissociation or separation or divide in our consciousness. We don't experience that in terms of our identity. So dissociative disorders are very uncommon, they're very rare, and they're also very controversial. And so this is when someone becomes separated and disassociated from previous memories, thoughts, and identity. So you got these critical aspects of what makes someone who they are, their identity, right? They're parts of their personality and like their memory, and it's completely split, right? It's completely disrupted. So it's different from personality disorders. It's different from schizophrenia in the sense that you have an entire separation and an entire divide. And two of the most common forms of dissociative disorders is dissociative identity disorder and dissociative amnesia. So dissociative identity disorder was formerly known as multiple personality disorder. Dissociative amnesia is when you have this inability to recall really important information, personal information about your past. People with this will oftentimes need to be put under some kind of psychiatric care because they will just wander aimlessly. So this is related to the fugue state. Now, dissociative identity disorder, or DID, previously known as multiple personality disorder, it is a controversial one, and it's very rare, in which a person becomes completely disassociated or separated from themselves and exhibits two or more distinct alternating personalities. Typically, the original personality will deny any sort of awareness with any of the other personalities or selves that person is taking on. And when we look at some of the explanations of this disorder and the development of DID, they say 90% of DID cases occur because of some sort of childhood traumatic event like physical abuse or some type of sexual abuse. And psychodynamic, looking at it from the psychodynamic approach, dissociation is oftentimes related with coping mechanism called defense mechanisms, which we looked at in the personality unit. So how many personalities can a person have? They say they can have up from 2 to 100. So some famous cases, let's look at these. Joanne Woodward, who won the Academy Award for her 1958 portrayal of Chris Sizemore. And Chris Sizemore was someone who had struggled with DID and had 22 different distinct personalities. And in this movie and in this book, what Joanne Woodward did was she depicted 3 of the particular referenced personalities that were more developed that the doctors referenced, and that was the meek and bland Eve White, as you can see here on the right, and then you have the dominant and carefree Eve Black, and then on the left here you've got the mature and intellectual Jane. Another common or famous case is Shirley Mason. All right, Shirley Mason was a psychiatric patient taken on by Cornelia B. Wilbur, who was actually a Freudian psychologist, neo-Freudian psychologist looking at the psychodynamic approach. And their sessions together actually developed this book named Sybil. Her life formed the basis of this best-selling book, and now there are 2 movies about it. I haven't actually seen the film myself, but I've heard that the first film is far better than the second one, so that's on my to-do list. Maybe we'll watch it this year, actually, after the AP exam. Now, looking at some of the critics, right, and what they say about dissociative identity disorder, they argue these 3 specific things, right? First one, critics argue that the diagnosis of DID increased in the late 20th century and in the early 21st century. So generally speaking, disorders should be fairly consistent, right? The diagnosis should be fairly consistent. And in this case, there was this huge spike of cases of this disorder in the late 20th and early 21st century. And it's now starting to decrease since then. So there is some skepticism there. Next, you have that DID was not found in other countries, so it's found mostly in Western cultures, predominantly in the US. And then lastly, we have the learned response that reinforces reductions in anxieties, right? So other critics believe that DID is not an actual disorder, and that people use it as being basically a con artist or role-playing to ease anxieties in his or her daily life. So these are some of the critiques towards this disorder. So I want you to go ahead and respond to this question in the comment section. All right, so take a minute to do that. Okay, lastly, we're going to look at personality disorders, specifically antisocial personality disorder. But personality disorders are the inflexible, enduring behavior patterns seen that generally impair our social functioning. So a big difference between personality disorders and other disorders that we've looked at is there's an absence of delusion, okay, and there's also an absence of known depression. So it's somewhat controversial as well as the other disorders we've been looking at today, because some of these symptoms are fairly subjective. But you see it personalities form in these 3 clusters, and so all these different personality disorders that are out there fall under these clusters, and some of them fall under both of the clusters or all 3 of the clusters, but they help differentiate between the differences of these disorders. So cluster C, you're looking at anxiety. This is going to be related to fearful sensitivity or exhibiting anxious behavior or fearful behavior, often paired with OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, not to be confused with OCD. And then you've got cluster B, eccentric or odd, such as emotionless, disengagement. Oftentimes this relates to antisocial personality disorder because you have this lack of empathy for others. You're very self-centered, and oftentimes this can even be related to possibly self-harm or harm of others. And then cluster A, dramatic or impulsive. Okay, this is where you're really going to see more so of a narcissistic behavior and a dangerous behavior seen in like antisocial personality disorder, where people are exhibiting suspicious paranoia or social isolation or perceptual distortions of distrust in others. So these are the different clusters. Now, this is really important for you to understand. You do need to remember this for the AP exam, but antisocial personality disorder, when you think of this, don't think of, I don't want to be social. That's more so related to avoidant personality disorder, where you're anxious about fearful sensitivity of rejection and withdrawal, social withdrawal. But this is more like, think of antisocial personality as that person shouldn't be social, right? However, they're still, they may actually still be incredibly charming, and they can lure people in to really like them and then that's when they do a lot of damage to people. So APD is a disorder in which a person, generally in men, exhibits a lack of conscience for wrongdoing, even towards friends and family. So APD must include at least 3 of these following symptoms below, right? So a lack of conforming to laws. Oftentimes you'll see a lot of criminal behavior, repeated deceitfulness in relationships, so a lot of lying, a lot of deceitfulness, failure to think or plan ahead. Number 4, tendency to be irritable, angry, aggressive, either hurting themselves or hurting others. And then they also show a complete disregard for any sort of personal safety of themselves or of others. Now, this cannot be diagnosed until 18 years of age. So if you think, a child at 13 or 10 or 11 that shows maybe like ODD, like oppositional defiant disorder, that's different, and that's not related to a personality disorder. So don't get those mixed up. Don't try to diagnose a child or wonder if a child at age 11 or 12 has APD. That can't be diagnosed until age 18 at the earliest. So looking at genetical factors, also really important to understand when looking at APD. Causes of this, some have suggested that there are genetic predispositions related to the autonomic and the central nervous system, and the fact that there is very little or low arousal in response to specific threats or aversive events. This causes that individual to be more reckless, in a sense, of their own bodies and other people around them, because they don't feel anxious or they feel nervous, right? So if I punch someone in the face just because I don't like their shirt, right? If I actually had that thought, I would be really nervous and I probably wouldn't do it, right? But if I had low autonomic or central nervous system arousal, I wouldn't feel nervous about punching that person in the face. And so I would just go punch him in the face, right? And then cause a fight. Yeah, so you don't have a sense of understanding of your emotions. Also, that's why that relates to the underdevelopment of the amygdala. So they say they do see in some of these brains of people who deal with APD have some sort of underdeveloped amygdala. Now, there are also nurture-based psychologists that argue environmental factors like broken homes, like rejection of parents, poor discipline, lack of attachment, and these things lead to some of the major reasons for these behaviors exhibited in APD. BTK, this is a copy of the paper, the Wichita Eagle, which is where I'm from, and it was published back in 2004. What grade was I in 2004? Like 6th grade? Or something like that. Maybe I was in like 7th grade. And so BTK resurfaced. He was this famous American serial killer, and definitely not something that Wichita's proud of, but he did come from my home state, and he killed 10 innocent women and children, and he was definitely somebody who dealt with antisocial personality disorders. He had a complete disregard for others and found this sense of ego and fulfillment and pleasure in the sense of killing people. He wrote a lot of these really bone-chilling letters to the Wichita Eagle as he was killing these innocent victims over the course of his murders. And it freaked a lot of people out, especially the media. Sometimes the news reporters thought that they were going to be the next victim, like the news anchors, the female news anchors. So, here's an interview. If you want to read through some of this, I'm not going to read it to you, but this was during an interview that he gave to a local television reporter after he confessed to his murders. He probably would have never been found out, to be honest. The only reason he really got found out was because he turned himself in after 30 years. And probably a major reason why he did that is because of that desire for ego and that desire for fame. And as you can see here, he talks about like his feelings for his victims, and like he says he does have feelings for his victims, but his feelings for the people that he murdered and killed and tortured, he found like this sense of sexual high and this sense of ego high. And so he was, I remember he talks about how he's like sexually aroused by all of it. And oh, it's pretty sick stuff. If you want to look into it, you can. But yeah, that guy's from my hometown, unfortunately. Now, understanding antisocial personality disorder, I do want to go back and preference, like, just because someone has antisocial personality disorder doesn't mean they're going to be the next serial killer, okay? Some of their criminal activities may be very, very minor, all right? So don't necessarily associate anybody with antisocial personality disorder as like the next serial killer and that they're going to murder you, because a lot of times it's not actually the case. But they do have difficulties with social interaction, and they can tend to be violent, but they probably won't kill you. Okay, so just want to put that out there. Anyways, this shows PET scans of 41 murderers revealed that had a sense of reduced activity in their frontal lobes. So researchers have found that reduced activation in a murderer's frontal lobe is seen, as you can tell here on the left. There's a lot more yellow and red activity, whereas on the right there is not as much yellow and red activity. So the frontal lobe area helps break these impulsive behaviors, and so when that's not activated, those tend to rise and be more frequent. So for our last slide today, looking at personality disorders, we're going to talk about the biopsychosocial roots of crime. All right, so if we look at all those factors, we look at the childhood poverty factors, the environmental factors, and obstetrical complications in terms of biology, put those together, the results show that in both stressful and non-stressful situations, a child could be convicted between ages 18 to 26, but the chance is relatively low. However, when those are combined together, both of those factors, you have a significant increase in terms of percentage of criminal offenders. All right, so it's not necessarily a bad gene or a bad environment that causes these antisocial behaviors, but when there is a combination of them, generally speaking, you're going to see an increase in that percentage or that likelihood of those antisocial behaviors occurring. All right, that's it for today, and we have now finished looking at the disorders. So next unit, next class, when I post a lecture, it's going to be related to treatment. So stay tuned for that. All right, see you everybody. Take care.